40 years of work, gone in one night. Everyone called it an accident. But one person knew the truth, and she was only 10. The whole street was panicking, everyone except one man, watching it all with a little smile. Nora saw it, and she understood what nobody else did. Just a bored kid wandering the office hallway until she heard a voice she knew, making a plan she was never meant to hear. Midnight. The safe. The real criminal walked free, and the police arrested the innocent one, Nora's father. Everyone believed he did it. Everyone except a 10-year-old girl. She told them everything, the plan, the safe, but all they saw was a kid with a wild story. Quite an imagination, they said. So she decided to prove it. The man who framed her father sat inside, pretending to care, so Nora looked through his car window. And what she found there changed everything. It was almost midnight when the phone rang. By the time they got there, the whole building was lit up against the sky. Bennett Manufacturing, 40 years of one family's work, going up right in front of their eyes. Thomas just stood there, frozen. Sarah held the kids close, and not one of them understood yet how a night like this even begins. But someone did. Someone had been counting on it all along. The whole street had come out to watch. Firefighters shouting, neighbors with their hands over their mouths. And in the middle of all of it, Nora saw something nobody else did. A man at the edge of the crowd, not panicked, not sad, just watching the flames with the smallest smile on his face. Robert Hayes, her dad's right-hand man for 15 years. And in that 1 second, Nora's blood went cold. To understand that smile, you have to go back. One day earlier, in a corner office high above the city, 2 men were arguing. Thomas Bennett wanted to protect his workers, their health care, their pensions. His finance chief, Robert Hayes, wanted to cut all of it. "You're too soft to run this place," Robert sneered. Thomas had heard enough. "We're done. Get out." Robert left smiling, like a man who'd already decided how this would end. That evening, Thomas came home heavy. He told Sarah everything, the fight, the threats, the way Robert had looked at him. 15 years, he said. I trusted that man 15 years. What he didn't know was that 2 small shadows were listening from the hallway. Nora and her little brother Sam, in their pajamas, catching every word. Sam didn't really understand it, but Nora did, and it stuck with her all night. The next morning was supposed to be ordinary. No school, one of those teacher days. Mom had to work, and the sitter called to cancel at the last minute. Thomas didn't love the idea of leaving Nora home alone, so he made her an offer over breakfast. "Come to the office with me. Bring a book, keep me company." Nora grinned and ran for her shoes. Neither of them had any idea what that day would bring. Out front, Sarah loaded Sam into the car. She had a full day ahead, and Sam was tagging along. She kissed Thomas on the cheek, told him not to work too late, waved at Nora in the doorway. It was such an ordinary goodbye. The kind you don't think twice about. The kind you'd give anything to do over again, if only you'd known what was coming. At the office, Thomas got straight to work. Phone calls, spreadsheets, the endless stack of a man trying to keep a company alive. Nora curled up in the big leather chair across from his desk with a book and a juice box. And for a while, it was nice. Just the 2 of them, the quiet hum of the building. She had no idea the most important thing she'd ever overhear was waiting just down the hall. After an hour, the book got boring. Nora slid off the chair. Dad, can I walk around? Thomas barely looked up from his screen. Sure, sweetheart. Just don't go far. So she wandered out into the long, quiet hallway, running her fingers along the wall, peeking into empty meeting rooms. Just a kid killing time. Until she heard a voice she knew. Low, careful, and somehow wrong. Around the corner, Robert Hayes stood with his back to her, phone pressed to his ear. His voice low, the kind people use when they don't want to be heard. Nora froze and listened. Tonight, midnight, I clear the safe, then the storage room goes up. They'll call it an electrical fault. A pause, then quieter. By morning, I'm gone. Mexico. Just like we said. Nora's heart slammed against her ribs. That night, Nora couldn't hold it in. She told Sam everything, whispering in the dark. Sam's eyes went wide. I believe you, he said. I always believe you. But when she tried her dad, it came out sounding like a story. Sweetheart, you've got quite an imagination, Thomas said, kissing her forehead. He didn't mean anything by it. He just had no idea his 10-year-old had just handed him the truth. All night, Nora lay awake, replaying it. The low voice, the words. Midnight, the safe, Mexico. But in the daylight, it started to sound ridiculous. Robert had worked for her dad for 15 years. He came to their barbecues. He'd given her a birthday card once, with a $5 bill tucked inside. Men like that didn't burn down buildings. Did they? Maybe she'd heard it wrong. Maybe it was a movie he was talking about, or some joke she didn't get. Her dad had laughed it off. Her mom would have too. And the more she turned it over, the smaller and sillier it felt. She was 10. What did she really know about any of it? By the time she finally fell asleep, she'd almost talked herself out of it. Almost. There was just one little piece of her, way down deep, that wouldn't let it go. It happened just before midnight. The phone, sharp and loud in the dark house. Nora heard her dad's bare feet hit the floor, heard his voice change halfway through, hello. Then doors, keys, her mom's worried questions. The building? Thomas said. The building's on fire. And just like that, the night Nora had been dreading, without even knowing she was dreading it, arrived. They drove fast, nobody talking. And when they turned the last corner, there it was. Bennett Manufacturing, glowing orange against the black sky. 40 years of her family's life, lit up in the windows, firefighters everywhere, hoses, shouting, that deep, roaring sound. Thomas was out of the car before it even stopped. Sarah grabbed the kid's hands and held on, and Nora stood frozen on the sidewalk, staring up at it, one terrible thought screaming in her head. He did it. He actually did it. And I knew. By dawn, it was over. The building still smoking, black and broken against the morning sky. But the neighbors' shops were safe. And thank goodness, the place had been empty. No one had been inside. Detective Maria Rodriguez arrived with the first light. Sharp eyes, a notebook. The kind of calm that comes from having done this 100 times. The fire had started on the 3rd floor, in a storage room. She walked the whole building slow, and then she stopped at the safe. Thomas had told her it should hold $300,000. Payroll, emergency funds. She pulled the heavy door open. Empty, completely empty. Rodriguez stood there a moment, then wrote a single line in her notebook. Not just a fire, she said quietly. Somebody emptied this first, then lit the place up to cover it. theft, and arson. Somebody had planned this down to the minute, and that's when Robert Hayes made his move. He was right there at the scene, of course, playing the loyal, heartbroken right-hand man, shaking his head, wiping his eyes. But when he got Detective Rodriguez alone, his voice dropped low. "I hate to even say this," he murmured, "but Thomas, he's been under so much pressure lately. The company's been bleeding money for months, and the insurance on this building, it's substantial." He let the words just hang there. "I'm sure it's nothing. I'd never forgive myself if I stayed quiet." It was perfect. Quiet. Reasonable. The concerned friend, planting a knife and calling it worry. Rodriguez didn't say much, but she wrote it down. And just like that, the arrow that should have pointed straight at Robert swung around, slow and steady, and came to rest on Thomas Bennett. The man who'd lost everything was about to be blamed for losing it. By afternoon, they were asking Thomas questions. Not cruel ones, just careful ones. "You changed the safe combination last week, Mr. Bennett. Who else knew it?" Thomas rubbed his face. "Just me. And Robert. And the company's finances. They've been difficult lately." "Everyone's finances are difficult," he said. "That doesn't mean—" He stopped, because he could see it now. Could see exactly how it looked from the outside. A struggling business, a big insurance policy, a fire that started after hours when nobody was around, a safe only he could open, emptied clean, every fact lining up like soldiers, and every single one of them pointing at him. "I didn't do this," Thomas said. His voice cracked on the last word. Rodriguez looked at him for a long moment. She wanted to believe him. She really did. But wanting wasn't the same as proof. And right now, every bit of the proof was on the other side. It moved fast after that. By the next morning, Thomas Bennett wasn't just a man who'd lost his company. He was a suspect. The prime suspect. Nobody said it in those exact words, but everyone understood. When the officers came to the house, Sarah stood in the doorway with one hand pressed to her mouth. Nora and Sam watched from the stairs, too stunned to even cry. Their dad, the gentlest man they knew, the one who'd refused to cut a single worker's health plan, being walked to a car like a criminal. "It's a misunderstanding," Thomas kept saying, calm for their sake. "I'll be home soon, I promise." But his eyes told a different story, and as the car pulled away, Nora felt something cold settle in her chest. This was her fault. She'd known the truth all along, and she'd stayed quiet. And then the story got out. It was on the news by that evening. "Local business owner under investigation in suspicious fire," the anchor said. And there was the building, smoking, on every screen. By morning, it was everywhere. People who'd smiled at Thomas for years suddenly had opinions. Always something a little off about him. Probably in debt up to his ears. Burned his own place for the insurance. Can you imagine? None of them knew him. None of them had been in the room. But that didn't stop the whispers. At school, kids looked at Nora differently. At the grocery store, conversations went quiet the second Sarah walked in. The Bennett name, the one Thomas's father had spent 40 years building, turned into something shameful overnight. And the man who'd actually done it? He was watching it all unfold, smiling. Nora couldn't take it anymore. She begged her mom to drive her to the police station, and when she finally sat down across from Detective Rodriguez, she told her everything. The phone call, the hallway, midnight, The safe. The combination 7429. Mexico. The whole thing, exactly as she'd heard it. Rodriguez listened. She really did. Wrote a few things down, but Nora could see it in her face, that gentle, patient look grown-ups get when they've already decided you're making it up. "Sweetheart," the detective said kindly, "you've been through something frightening. Sometimes our minds fill in details to make sense of it." "I'm not making it up," Nora said. "I heard him. I know it feels that way." And that was it. A 10-year-old's word against a respected man in a suit. Closed before it ever opened. Nora walked out shaking. Not from fear this time. From anger. That night, the house was silent. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, not eating, not talking. Just staring at his hands. The man who'd always had an answer, always had a plan. He had nothing now. Sarah tried to hold it together for the kids. But Nora saw her crying in the hallway when she thought no one was looking. And somewhere out there, a few hours away, Robert Hayes was loading a bag into his car. Cash. A passport that didn't carry his name. A long, quiet drive to the border, where someone would be waiting at 6 in the morning. Every minute that ticked by, he got closer to gone. And her dad got closer to taking the fall for all of it. Nora stood in the doorway, watching her father break in half. And right there, she made up her mind. Telling the truth hadn't worked, so she'd have to do something else. She'd have to prove it. She found Sam in his room and closed the door behind her. "I need your help," she said. "And it's going to be kind of scary." Sam put down his toy. "Is it about Dad?" She nodded. "The police won't believe me because I'm a kid. So just talking isn't enough. We need proof, something real. Something they can't say, I imagined." Sam thought about it for about 2 seconds. "Okay," he said. "I'm in." Just like that. No arguing, no doubting. Her little brother, 8 years old, ready to go to war for their dad. Nora almost cried. "Then here's what we know," she said, and started counting it on her fingers. The combination. The 3rd floor, Mexico, 6 in the morning. Little pieces of a plan only the real criminal could possibly know. "If we can find just one thing that matches," she whispered. "Just one. They'll have to listen." The hunt was on. The next afternoon, the phone rang at the Bennett house. It was Robert. "Just calling to check on you all," he said in that warm, oily voice. "Such a terrible time. I'll swing by this evening, see if there's anything you need." Sarah, too exhausted to suspect a thing, thanked him. But Nora, listening from the stairs, felt her whole body go still. "Robert, here, tonight." And then it hit her. If he was leaving for the border at dawn, his car would already be packed. Everything he was running with would be sitting right there in the driveway, while he sat inside pretending to care. She grabbed Sam. "He's coming tonight," she whispered. "And I think everything we need is going to be in his car." Sam's eyes went huge. "You want to look in his car?" "Not break in," Nora said quickly. "Just look, through the windows, while he's inside talking to Mom." It was risky. If he caught them, he'd know she knew, and he'd vanish before anyone could stop him. But it was the only shot they had. They worked it out in whispers. Sam would keep watch by the porch. Nora would check the car, one look, a few photos, in and out, before Robert ever finished his fake concern. Sunset came, and a pair of headlights turned slowly onto their street. Robert parked at the curb and walked up to the house, all sad smiles and a casserole dish he'd probably bought on the way. The moment the front door closed behind him, Nora slipped out the side gate. Sam took his post by the porch, heart hammering. Nora crept up to Robert's car in the fading light. The windows weren't tinted. She cupped her hands against the glass and looked inside. And her breath caught. There, on the passenger seat, sat a leather bag, unzipped, stuffed too full to close, and spilling out of the top, thick, banded stacks of cash. More money than Nora had ever seen in her life. Beside it, a travel folder. She leaned closer, squinting. A one-way ticket, south, across the border, leaving in the morning. And tucked into the folder, a passport, flipped open. There was Robert's face, staring up from the little photo. But the name printed underneath it wasn't Robert Hayes. It was somebody else entirely. Nora's hands started to tremble. This was it. This was everything. The money, the escape, the fake name. Not a story, not her imagination. The actual physical proof of the actual crime. Sitting 12 inches away, behind a pane of glass. Every single word she'd heard in that hallway was true. And now, finally, she could prove it. She just leaned in to look when the front door opened. Light spilled across the lawn, and Robert's voice, easy as anything. "I'll just grab something from the car, Sarah. 1 second." Footsteps, coming her way. There was nowhere to go. No time to run for the gate. So Nora did the only thing left. She dropped down behind the car and went still. Knees in the gravel, back against the cold metal. One hand on the tire to keep her balance. She could see his shoes now, under the car, coming closer. And from the porch, Sam saw the whole thing happening. Her little brother, 8 years old, stepped right into the light. "Mr. Hayes?" Too loud, way too loud. "Is it true you're going on a trip?" The shoes stopped. "Where'd you hear that, sport?" "I heard Mom say it." Sam's voice was shaking. Nora could hear it from behind the car. But he kept going. "I don't want you to go." A pause, and then a low chuckle. The shoes turned around, headed back toward the porch, toward Sam. "Just a little work trip, buddy. I'll be back before you know it." Behind the car, Nora let out a breath she'd been holding so long her chest hurt. He hadn't seen her. He'd been 2 feet away, and he hadn't seen her. Her brother had just saved the whole thing, with nothing but a shaky voice and a little bit of nerve. She stayed down, didn't move a muscle, not until she heard the front door close again. Then, slowly, she lifted her head. Her hands were trembling. Her heart was going like a drum. But she wasn't done yet. The second Robert disappeared back inside, Nora moved. She pulled her phone from her hoodie pocket. The little phone her parents had given her for emergencies, the one she'd never really needed until right now. Her hands were shaking so badly, she almost dropped it. "Focus," she told herself. "You only get one chance at this." She raised it to the car window and started taking pictures. The bag of cash, click. The travel folder, click. She zoomed in on the ticket, on the date, on the border crossing printed across the top. Click, click. And then the passport. The hard one. She had to wait for the porch light to catch it just right. So Robert's photo and that false name were both readable in the same frame. She held her breath, steadied her hands, and click. Got it. Clear as day. A man with Robert Hayes' face and a stranger's name, sitting on a pile of money, holding a one-way ticket out of the country. She checked the screen. The photos were sharp. They were real. Everything the grown-ups had refused to believe, captured right there on a 10-year-old's phone. Nora slid it back into her pocket like it was made of glass. From the porch, Sam stared at her, wide-eyed. She gave him the tiniest nod. We got it. Now they had to run. They didn't wait for morning. They couldn't. Nora knew that by sunrise, Robert would be across the border and gone for good, photos or no photos. So the moment his car pulled away from the house, she grabbed Sam's hand. Sarah, frantic, drove them straight to the police station the second Nora blurted out that she had proof, real proof, on her phone. They burst through the doors, breathless, and Nora marched right up to the front desk. "I need Detective Rodriguez," she said. "Right now. It's about the Bennett fire." The officer started to give her the same gentle brush-off she'd heard 100 times. But then Rodriguez appeared in the hallway, and something in Nora's face made her stop cold. "Let her through," the detective said. Nora didn't waste a second. She pulled out her phone, hands still trembling, and held it up. "I know you didn't believe me before," she said. "But look, just look." And she started swiping through the photos. The cash, the ticket, the passport with Robert's face and the wrong name, one after another. Rodriguez took the phone slowly. Her eyes moved across the screen, and Nora watched that calm, patient, doubting expression finally crack right down the middle. The detective looked up. "Where did you get these?" she whispered. "Tonight," Nora said. "He's leaving tonight." Detective Rodriguez looked at those photos for a long time. The cash, the ticket, the passport, Robert's face, somebody else's name. She swiped back and forth, slow, like she was hoping she'd misread something. She hadn't, and Nora watched the exact moment it happened. The moment a grown-up finally believed her. It wasn't loud. There were no apologies, no big speech. Just the detective's jaw going tight, and her eyes lifting off the screen with something new in them. Not pity this time, not patience. Something closer to fear. "Tell me again," Rodriguez said quietly. "Everything you heard in that hallway, word for word." So Nora did. The midnight plan, the safe, the combination, 7429. The storage room on the 3rd floor, the fire made to look like bad wiring, Mexico, 6 in the morning. And with every detail, the detective's face changed a little more. Because here was the thing. Nora knew the safe combination. A 10-year-old. She knew the floor the fire started on. She knew about the border, the timing, the fake name. There was no way, no possible way. A kid could know all of that unless every single word of it was true. The fire did start on the 3rd floor, Rodriguez murmured, almost to herself. "We never released that. It was never in the news." She set the phone down, looked at the 2 kids standing in front of her, the girl who wouldn't quit, and her little brother who'd backed her the whole way. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Both of you. I should have listened the first time." Then she turned, and her whole voice changed, sharp, fast. The voice of someone who's just realized the clock is running out. "I need everyone," she called across the room. "Now, we've got a suspect in the Bennett fire fleeing the country, tonight." The whole station snapped into motion. Phones, radios, people moving fast. And Nora just stood there in the middle of it, holding Sam's hand, watching the thing she'd been screaming into the dark for days finally catch fire and spread. Somebody believed her. After all of it, somebody finally believed her. What happened next happened in minutes. Detective Rodriguez was a different person now. No more careful questions, no more doubt. She had photos of stolen cash, a one-way ticket, and a forged passport, all tied to a man heading for the border. That was everything she needed. "All units," she said into the radio, fast and clear. "We have a suspect in the Bennett manufacturing fire and theft. Robert Hayes, white male, 40s, navy suit, driving alone. Believed to be traveling toward the southern border under a false name. He's carrying approximately $300,000 in cash and a forged passport. Consider him a flight risk. I want eyes on every route south." She pulled up a map, traced the highways with her finger. Robert had a head start, but not as big as he thought. He had no idea anyone was looking for him. As far as he knew, his plan had worked perfectly. The fire, the blame landing on Thomas, the slow, quiet drive to a new life. He thought he'd won. He didn't know a 10-year-old girl had looked through his car window. He didn't know there were photos. He didn't know that right now his face and his fake name were going out to every patrol car and border checkpoint between here and Mexico. "He thinks he's home free," Rodriguez said, mostly to herself, watching the map. "Let's go ruin his night." Out in the lobby, Nora and Sam sat side by side on a hard plastic bench, waiting. Sarah had her arms around both of them. Nobody said much. There was nothing to do now but wait, and hope they weren't too late. Nora kept her eyes on the big clock on the wall. Each tick felt enormous. Somewhere out there in the dark, Robert Hayes was driving south, humming along to the radio, thinking he'd gotten away with everything. And closing in behind him, mile by mile, was a little girl's courage, turned into flashing lights and radios and a whole department that finally believed her. They caught him just before the border. Red and blue lights cut across the highway, and Robert Hayes had nowhere left to run. He pulled over. Nothing else to do. He tried at first. Of course he did. Slid right back into that smooth, reasonable voice, the one that had fooled everyone for 15 years. "Officers, there's been some mistake. I'm just visiting family. I run a respectable company. Well, I help run one." Then they opened the bag on the passenger seat. The cash, still banded, the ticket, and the passport, his face on it, somebody else's name under it. And the smooth voice just ran out. There's a moment when someone's been pretending a very long time, where the mask comes off. This was Robert's. Side of a dark highway, suit all wrinkled, everything he'd done spread out across the seat of his own car. No more charm. No more sad little shakes of the head at the fire. No more whispering lies about a good man. Just Robert. Caught. A perfect crime. That was the plan, anyway. And he'd built it carefully. The timing, the cover story, that fake wiring. Even worked out how to leave Thomas holding the blame. Covered every angle he could think of. Down to the smallest thing. Missed one, though. The phone call. He'd made it off in a hallway he was sure stood empty. Turned out somebody had been standing there the whole time. So they walked him over, sat him in the back of the patrol car. One of the officers got on the radio. "Suspect in custody. Got the money, got the passport. Tell the Bennett family, it's over." It's over. 2 words. After the longest few days of their lives. 15 years Robert Hayes spent making himself look loyal. One night tearing a good family apart. And in the end, brought down by the one person he never even noticed was standing in the room. A 10-year-old girl in a red hoodie who heard the truth and wouldn't let it go. They let Thomas go as the sun was coming up. The charges, gone. Every one of them. With Robert caught, the cash recovered, and that forged passport sitting in an evidence bag, there was nothing left to hold Thomas Bennett on. The case against him fell apart as fast as it had been built. Nora would remember that morning for the rest of her life. The station doors opening, her dad walking out into the early light, tired, unshaven, looking like he'd aged 10 years in 3 days. And then him seeing them, his family, waiting for him on the steps. Sarah got to him first. She practically ran. He caught her and held on like he'd never let go. And then Nora and Sam hit them both at full speed. And the four of them just stood there in a tangle on the station steps, holding each other, not saying anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. When Thomas finally pulled back, he held Nora's face in both his hands. His eyes were wet. "They told me what you did," he said. "All of it. The car, the photos." He shook his head slowly, like he couldn't quite believe it. "You were the only one who knew. The whole time. And nobody listened to you, including me." "It's okay, Dad," Nora said. "No," he said gently. "It isn't. I told you you had a big imagination." He let out a broken little laugh. "Turns out you had something a lot more important than that." He pulled both kids in close. "You had the truth," he said, "and you were brave enough to fight for it when nobody, not one single person, would stand with you, except each other." The company was gone. The building, the years of work, all of it. Thomas would have to start again from nothing. And standing on those steps in the morning sun, with his family wrapped around him, he understood something he'd somehow forgotten under all that pressure. He hadn't lost everything. The only things that had ever really mattered were right here, holding on to him, refusing, the way they always had, to let him go. Things didn't snap back to normal right away. Real life doesn't work like that. Rebuilding a company from ashes, that takes time. Insurance meetings, bank meetings, long nights at the kitchen table, Thomas hunched over paperwork that never seemed to end. But here's what was different this time. The whole town knew the truth now. Those same neighbors who'd whispered, they showed up to help. Old employees drifted back. People Thomas had been good to over the years remembered it and gave it back. Slowly, piece by piece, Bennett Manufacturing started coming back. Smaller than before, for now, but real, built on something Robert Hayes never once understood. People who actually wanted to see you make it. Few weeks later, the family sat around the breakfast table on a perfectly ordinary morning. Sun through the window. Sam talking with his mouth full. Sarah pouring juice. Smell of toast. Just a normal day. The kind that, not so long ago, they figured they might never get back. Thomas looked across at his daughter, buttering her toast in that red hoodie she practically lived in. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking. Bennett Manufacturing might need a junior detective on the payroll one of these days." Nora rolled her eyes. "I'm 10. Best investigator I ever met was 10. And he wasn't really joking, because this is the thing Thomas would carry the rest of his life. The night his whole world burned down, the truth nearly slipped away for good. Nearly. The grown-ups got it wrong. The police got it wrong. He got it wrong too. The only one who got it right was a little girl nobody would listen to, and her little brother, who didn't doubt her for a second. No power, no proof, nobody on her side. All she had was what she'd heard, and a stubborn, fierce refusal to let an innocent man take the fall. And somehow, that was enough. Because sometimes the most important person in the room is the smallest one. The one being told they're imagining things. The one nobody bothers to hear. And every now and then, that's exactly who's holding the truth in their hands. Waiting, hoping, refusing to give it up, until somebody's finally brave enough to listen. Nora caught her dad watching her, and she smiled. Outside, the morning was just getting started,